This is Event Masters. Behind the scenes stories, experiences, and lessons shared by the world's leading event experts. Hosted by Christian Napier.
We've got another episode of Event Masters for you today. And our guest, I have to say, it's not every day that I get to talk to somebody who actually can claim Hall of Famer in their title. And we're dealing with a real Hall of Famer today. Frank Supovitz is joining us. Frank, thank you so much for taking the time. How are you?
I'm great, Christian. It's great to be here with you today.
Well, I'm honored to have you, Frank. Before we get started into story time and looking back at your amazing career, why don't you tell us where you're joining us from today and what you're up to?
I'm joining you from Long Island, New York, about 35 miles to the east of Manhattan. I started working out of my home, as so many people did after COVID. I used to have an office in Lower Manhattan, and when COVID hit, that kind of went away. And well, there was no real good reason to go back to Manhattan. I'm enjoying my commute on a flight of steps instead of on the Long Island Railroad. So that's where I am today.
Likewise, when COVID hit, all my travel stopped, and I'm joining you from my home office that is just steps away from all of the critical infrastructure I need to do my job, which is the restroom and the kitchen, right? So it's all good. Well, Frank, I mentioned Hall of Famer. So you were actually inducted into the Event Industry Hall of Fame in 2006. You're also an author. So you've authored, how many books have you authored, Frank?
I think I'm in the process of number 5. I'm
writing the process of number 5.
Yes.
I mean, you're the de facto. You have written the book on managing and delivering live events. So, wow, this is incredible. Currently, you are the founder. You run a company called Fast Traffic, right?
That's right.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that organization?
Yeah, Fast Traffic has been just so much fun because it really touches on every part of the event business, every part of the venue business even. We work project to project. We put project teams together for any number of clients. For the first 6 or 7 years, we were located in Lower Manhattan at the South Street Seaport, New York City. And part of the reason was that I was on the development team for the rooftop at Pier 17, which is just to the south of the Brooklyn Bridge, about 3 blocks. And brand new open air concert and event facility on the roof of a building that's jutting out into the East River. And it has become incredibly successful. In fact, I managed all of the operational elements for getting the building ready to host audiences of 3,400 or so. Up on the roof, and now they do about 65 concerts a summer, which is a very hard-working building here in New York. I no longer have them as a continuing client, but I did go back and do some work for them this summer in terms of evaluating how they're doing from an operational perspective, guest experience, security, all of those kinds of things. So South Street Seaport was a big part of what we did. We've been producing the pre-race show for the Indy 500 since 2016. This past summer, we were involved with the Major League Baseball draft, the Major League Baseball All-Star Red Carpet Show, the NFL's Hall of Fame game in Canton, Ohio, as well as the Pro Football Hall of Fame enshrinement ceremony. So we're involved in a ton of stuff. It's been great fun because every project is different.
Wow, that's amazing. And I'll probably dive into some of that a little bit later on in our conversation. You mentioned the National Football League there, the NFL. So for our global listeners, the American football, the National Football League. And prior to Fast Traffic, you actually worked for the National Football League as their senior vice president of events, working on all these Super Bowls. And I know you've got some Super Bowl stories, and I'm super excited to to dive into that. Before that, you led the National Hockey League's events and entertainment department. You developed this NHL Heritage Classic, which was the first stadium-based outdoor pro hockey game, which was a forerunner to the really super successful NHL Winter Classic, which is super cool to see. These venues, filled up. Maybe a football stadium that's got 70,000 people packed in there to watch a hockey game. I mean, it's really, really amazing. And then prior to that, served as a director of special events for Radio City Music Hall. Man, you've done so much. You've been awarded an honorary doctorate from Johnson in sports, entertainment, and event management from Johnson & Wales University. As I mentioned, inducted into the Event Industry Hall of Fame in 2006. In 2014, honored as New York University's Cal Ramsey Distinguished Lecturer. You've even been in movies. You had a cameo role in the film Draft Day, which was directed by Ivan Reitman. So, wow, it's amazing, and it's such an honor for me to have you join us today and share your story. And that story looks like a long, distinguished story, but I'm curious, Frank, how you actually got involved in all of this. Like, where did this come from? How did this start?
Oh, it was a total accident, and I backed right into it. And I do want to say something. I was involved in the development and creation of the Winter Classic, Heritage Classic back then, which was in Edmonton, Alberta. And I do want to just be on the record on it. I actually was a partner to the Edmonton Oilers on that one. Their head of marketing called me one day, and I will get into the beginning, but called me one day and had this crazy idea of doing the All-Star game, the NHL All-Star game outside. And ultimately, in our conversations, we ended up developing it as a regular season game, and we did that together. So I don't want to say that I did that alone. And in fact, you do none of these things alone. It always takes a big team of really big thinkers, and creative people and experts as well. So I just wanted to make sure that was on the record. Insofar as how I got started, I was actually a biology major in college. I had no experience in the business world at all. But I was an usher at Radio City Music Hall at the age of 15, actually. So I was still in high school at the time, and I worked weekends and put the monkey suit on and walk the aisles, and there were no Fitbits or Apple Watches at the time, so I have no idea how many steps I took, but a lot of it was up. And one of the things you learn being an usher is customer service, fan experience now we call it, but at the time it was all about service. And you learn so much starting from the bottom. When Radio City changed its format in 1979 to an all live format, it used to be a movie and a stage show, movie and a rockette show, you may recall. They started doing a lot of new and different things, and they offered me a job. I was graduating college at about the same time, and I had been accepted to a graduate program at Clemson University for master's in zoology. But I didn't have the money to go. I was really kind of stuck. And I said, you know what? I've got this job offer from Radio City to work in management for a year. I know the building. I know the people really well. I love the place. It's just, it still has a great amount of love in my heart. Why don't I do that for a year and I'll go back to school? And like so many people who say that, you never go back to school. I was having just too good a time. Working in the front of house, working in the back of house, learning the business by observation. And I did go back to school at night to get some business courses. I enrolled in an MBA program, which I didn't finish, but I did learn a lot about the business world from an academic perspective, as well as from, learn by doing. And as a consequence of that, I was promoted into The marketing department, I learned about concert promotion, event promotion, and those types of things. And the last job that they promoted me into was to help market this idea that they had to enter the special events business as a production company. So they not only did events in the building, but they also exported their creative and production expertise to third parties in other places around the world. And I was uh, really honored to get the opportunity to help them market that. I was coming out of the marketing department at the time, and while we were doing that, they also put me on the shows themselves. So I started as a talent coordinator, and then a director of talent, and then associate producer, and ultimately a producer, because I was just learning. I was learning by drinking from a fire hose. We did just so much work. One of those things turned out to be a Super Bowl halftime in 1988, working with as a Radio City person, working with the Rockettes and others, and learning big event production while I was doing that, because you didn't hire Radio City to do small things. You hired Radio City to do big things, and some of them were corporate events like the Coca-Cola Centennial or Polaroid's 50th anniversary. Some of them were big civic events like the bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution, 1987. We did the parade in Philadelphia in September of 1987, and then the Super Bowl halftime in January of 1988, which is Super Bowl 22. So we're well into the 50s now. That was 22, so it was a long time ago. And if you remember that far back, it had 88 grand pianos in it because it was 1988, 88 keys on the piano, and 88 pianos on the field. So, I learned a lot about the creative side of production as well. And, that's where I started. And ultimately, I was offered the opportunity to start the NHL's event department. They didn't have one. All of their events were matrix managed. They did a lot on the team level. There was an office in Montreal that did the draft, and there was a decision made to bring all of that into one place and hire somebody to do nothing but event production and event development and execution ultimately. And I ended up doing that for 13 seasons, as you suggested, and then moved on to the NFL to do another 10 seasons for them back in 2005.
Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack there, Frank. First of all, do you ever look back and think, what if? What if I would have pursued this career in biology and zoology? It hits close to home to me because I've got a daughter who's in her final semester of biology undergrad. And
That's
still
a tough
doesn't
major.
exactly know what she wants to do with it, So now I can tell her, well, you can always go into events, because they're hiring biology majors in events. But you ever think back to say, well, gosh, I wonder what life would have been like if I would have pursued that biology route?
Yeah, all the time. But, it's all about learning what you love to learn and doing what you love to do. And they don't have to be the same thing. That's okay. It makes you a more well-rounded person. To me, when I'm thinking about contingency planning, for example, when it comes to events, I take a very scientific approach to that. You change one variable at a time. That's the scientific approach, and see what that does. So I think that background benefited me. But I will say that, nowadays there's actually, and I primarily operate in the sports world, but there are sports management programs. I actually teach in one at Adelphi University. I'm an adjunct. And there are event management programs. Temple University in Philadelphia, for example, has a terrific one. There was none of that training when I got out of college or when I was in college. And if there had been, nobody would have hired me to do any of the things I did because there would have been people academically trained to do it. It was a very, very young industry in the late 70s, early 80s. And, they just had to put people who they felt they could trust to do these things and learn these things and figure these things out. But there wasn't that kind of academic training, and I'm grateful that there wasn't, to be honest.
Okay, wow. Well, the second part that I want to come back to, so that's really, really helpful, and I'm glad that you were able to extrapolate knowledge that you learned through university and biology and apply it. Uh, I experienced a similar thing. I graduated with a degree in accounting, and somehow fell into this event thing myself. And that being said, was able to apply a lot of the concepts I learned in accounting. But I want to come back to the career part of it, where you're with Radio City Music Hall for a long time, and then you make this decision to take this offer and go to the National Hockey League. And I'm curious what was going through your mind there. Did you think that, oh, I'm just going to be with Radio City Music Hall forever, and I love this job and it's awesome, now this other opportunity presents itself? What is your thought process going there, saying, do I stay doing something that I know and I love, and I've had opportunities to learn and grow, and they've given me opportunities, but now it's time to turn a new leaf and take this other opportunity? What was your mindset going into all of that?
Well, there was a step in between. There was a small event company called Adventures that was founded by the producer that I worked for at Radio City. So he had left. He had started his own company. He offered me the opportunity to come and work with him and own a piece of the company, which I did with another partner. So there were three of us. And it was based in New York. And we did a lot of the same kinds of things. And what we determined and what we had thought, and actually it had been validated, was, it's a people business. You don't hire companies, or you might in the beginning, but you develop relationships. And those relationships are what drives your business. And either you have great relationships and you drive a great business, or you have bad relationships and it affects you in the other way. So we did a lot of the same kinds of things. Now, you're right. I was at Radio City a very long time. I felt that I had stagnated a little bit, that it was hard to get to the next step once I got to a certain level. They weren't ready to turn the keys over to me, and that's okay. I just felt that I could learn more and contribute more by being somewhere else. Now, having said that, leaving Radio City was really hard. And I remember when I had made that decision, I felt like I sold my mother's house. I was really sad about it. But I never really looked back. And I never really took a job ever where I thought I was just going to be there for a little while. I always felt that wherever I was going to go, I was going to nest. When other opportunities came up that seemed like the next progression, if you will, I thought about it, and I didn't always do it, but I clearly did it a few times.
Well, let's hop into the NHL then, because one of the things that you sent me prior to us recording this, you sent a few stories which I thought were amazing, and one of those was about learning the hard way that hope is not a strategy, and that learning came through your first NHL All-Star game in Montreal. And so I'm curious for you, and I can't wait to hear the story behind this important lesson learned, that hope is not a strategy.
Yeah, I'm not the first person to say it, but it's 100% true. I was relatively new at the NHL. I had been there almost a year, and we were getting ready to play the All-Star game. It was 1993 in Montreal at the Montreal Forum, which is the temple of hockey, or was the temple of hockey before the Montreal Canadiens moved somewhere else. And it was the 75th anniversary of the league, but it was also the 100th birthday of the Stanley Cup. The Stanley Cup actually predates the NHL by about a quarter century. And so you have this priceless sterling silver trophy, the holy grail of that sport. And it was the All-Star game was being played on the 100th anniversary of the Stanley Cup in the city in which the most Stanley Cup champions were crowned. So it was very, very meaningful. And I, again, I wasn't new to the sport. I was a fan, but there's so much that you don't know when you're a fan. You're not on the inside of the culture. But I felt it was a really important thing to commemorate and celebrate that birthday, that anniversary. So I had this idea that we would have 3 Montreal Canadiens alumni whose names are engraved on the Stanley Cup multiple times skate around the rink with the cup above their heads to start the national broadcast. I thought that would really be cool. And apparently so do the Montreal Canadiens. So they helped me procure Maurice the Rocket Richard, Guy Lafleur, and Jean Beliveau, who were some of the greatest Montreal Canadiens ever. And they were in Canadiens gear, and they were sitting in the Zamboni tunnel about 10 minutes, prior to the game starting. And I got this radio call about 10 minutes ahead from the stage manager down there, wondering where the Stanley Cup was. Nobody knew where it was. And we're about to go on national television. Now, I knew where it was. It had been at my boss's sponsor brunch at a hotel across town. And I had asked him not to have it there or to let me have it earlier because, like any event person, you want your stuff and your people, there well ahead of time so that you're not like struggling if something happens. But he didn't want to do that. And frankly, it was my new boss. So I was really being overly respectful, as anybody would. But I said, I don't know. I hope it'll be there on time. I don't know if it's going to be, but I imagined it would be, and I really hoped. And of course, I just made that assumption. He's going to make sure it gets there because I told him what I needed it for and all of that, and it's not there. And I'm about to dump this segment just before we go on television. And sure enough, I get a radio call that the Stanley Cup's in the building. It's about 30 seconds before we go to air. And I said, great, get it out of the road box, get it into the hands of Maurice Richard, and let's go. And so out it comes. Maurice Richard grabs the trophy, he steps out onto the ice, holds it above his head, and he drops it. And it falls to the ice. And it makes a sound like I imagine the Liberty Bell might have when it was cracked. And sure enough, we damage this 100-year-old trophy. Not all, actually, the trophy, today's trophy is not quite 100 years old. The original bowl is somewhere else, but it's still old. It's still priceless. It's still sterling silver, and it's still dented. And I thought I was going to die. On national television. I'm not on national television. The Cup is. And then I look up and they're showing it on instant replay over and over again in slow motion. And it's just one of the most embarrassing moments of my life. Apparently what happened, it was minus 25 degrees in Montreal that day. And the streets are covered in ice. And when the cup keeper throws the cup in the back of a cab, the cab is just sitting in traffic. So I know none of this. So the cup keeper realizes he's not going to get there in time if he sits in the cab. So he takes the road box out of the cab and he's pushing it down the street on the ice and gets it to the Forum just in time. But what it did in the meantime was the trophy got chilled to minus 25. So with no time for it to be warmed up, it gets into the hands of Maurice Richard, and he can't hold it. It's just too darn cold. I'm surprised he didn't stick to it. And down the trophy went. Hope is not a strategy, right? If I didn't think, if I wasn't 100% sure that the trophy was going to be there on time, I should have done it at a different part of the game, right? During an intermission or during a whistle stoppage or something like that. It's an all-star game. I can get away with that. But because I wanted to do it at the beginning and I had no contingency plan to do it anywhere else, I had a bad plan. So I hoped it had worked out, and it didn't. And I should have known better, to be honest. So it's not my boss's fault. It was my fault. And that's where I learned that lesson.
Well, you're telling me this story, and especially the end there, and it's making me think back to your biology and scientific training. You talked about the variables. Nobody accounted for the variable that the trophy would be chilled to minus 25, and nobody could actually hold on to the thing because it would be physically impossible to hold it. It's just too cold. That's right. So, wow, what a great lesson. I wanted to touch on the NHL thing, the creation of this Heritage Classic. It's something that had been highlighted in your bio, and I wanted to understand what was the genesis of that. How did that idea come about, and how did you end up planning and ultimately delivering what has now turned into a really iconic event for hockey here in North
this
America.
Is a lesson of knowing who your audience is. And I think that's true if you're an event person, whether you do big public events or you're doing private events for a specific group. Knowing your audience is really important. So I mentioned before that I had gotten this call from the head of marketing at the Edmonton Oilers. His name was Alan Watt. His name is Alan Watt still. And he said, all right, we have this crazy idea of doing the All-Star game outside in a stadium. And a stadium game had been done already. Actually, Michigan State had done an outdoor stadium game, but it had never been done on the professional level. And I said to myself, boy, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And the reason I said that is because I did know my audience. All-Star games are not as much public events as they are big corporate hospitality events. So that's when leagues entertain their sponsors, their broadcasters, all of their partners. And I would say somewhere around half to 2/3 of the audience are invited guests that wouldn't normally be paying for a ticket. Fans make up the rest of it. And I said to myself, I don't see sponsors sitting outside in the winter, in the cold, to watch an All-Star game, which competitively is meaningless, right? They're not even that good in terms of being good games. I think by the second or maybe even the third period, people would be pretty much gone. And so I said to myself, this is really not a good idea. And so we hung up the phone, and then I called Alan back about 2 weeks later. And I said, all right, now it's my turn for a stupid idea. How about we think about playing this for 2 points? It's a regular season game. Can we do it as a regular season game? And Alan, to his credit, said, I was going to call you and ask you the same thing. So we spent a year really studying every contingency of what it would take. And what if it rained? What if we had a blizzard? What if it snowed? What if it was too warm? What if it wasn't warm enough? What if it was too cold? And so we went through everything, and we hired a physician from he was an Arctic surgeon or Arctic doctor that specialized in how people react to deep cold. He worked up in the northern Alberta. And So we looked at that, and we looked at, what would happen if it was pouring rain? What would happen if we had 12 inches of snow? Would we play the game? All of those kinds of things. And so we spent a year on that, and then we convinced the commissioner that we had a good plan. He didn't want to be embarrassed, didn't want to embarrass the NHL, and I don't blame him. And then it got on the schedule. Now we played that game in late November, and we picked that date for two reasons. One is we wanted the Edmonton Oilers to play the Montreal Canadiens, so it'd be two great Stanley Cup teams with Stanley Cup heritages, if you will. The second was we wanted it to be cold enough, but we felt that, I think it was November 22nd, it wouldn't be deep, 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 deep cold. And boy, were we surprised. It was -9 when we dropped the puck. It was very cold. I think that was the longest and deepest I've been cold. I've been in -30, but this was -9, and I was out there all day and into the night. It was really something. I mean, not 50, I think it was 57,000 fans filled Commonwealth Stadium. It was capacity. They played an alumni game first. So there was a Canadiens alumni, a Edmonton Oilers alumni, played that game. We had fans that were sitting in mummy bags, just incredibly cold. But that's knowing your audience. In Edmonton, they come out in that. I think if we did it for the first time somewhere in the U.S., it wouldn't have gone as well as it does now. Now that there's this tradition of doing these outdoor winter games. But if it was -9 even in New York or Boston or Detroit or Chicago, some of the older hockey, traditional hockey towns in the United States, I don't think we would have succeeded in doing it for the first time at Edmonton. In that it was a point of Canadian pride, and it sold out, and people were there. There was not an empty seat at the end of the game.
Well, what a fascinating story, and what a one of the things that's really interesting to me about it is this point that you made, which, hey, I know my audience, and having the wherewithal. I don't know if courage is the right word, but to say to the powers that be, hey, why don't we take this in a slightly different direction that I think could make this event more successful? Because, you could have just shied away from it and said, okay, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Let's do this for the All-Star game. And it could have turned out very, very differently. And so, I congratulate you for having that conviction, and having this gut feeling, this intuition based on your experience to say, you know what, that idea is interesting. Let me propose another one that could be potentially more successful.
Yeah, we got lucky with that one, I think.
Okay, so you're with the NHL for a long period of time, and then you transition to the NFL, the National Football League. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that transition? Moving on from NHL and then going to work for the NFL.
Yeah, it was a incredible opportunity. That, again, I thought I'd be at the NHL till I retired. I loved the sport, and I loved the fans, and I loved the players and the culture of the place. The people ask me what the differences are between the two leagues, and in Canada, and I'm an American, but in Canada, the NHL is the NFL. Like, it's dominant, and I recognize that it was a great responsibility, especially as an American, working on a Canadian heirloom, if you will, heirloom sport. But as I mentioned, when you're a fan, and I was a fan of hockey as I was a fan of football, you don't really understand the inner workings as well. I mean, people think they do, but they really don't till you're in it. And they all are very culturally different. You would do a um, a championship practice in public in hockey. You would never do that in football. Um, and there was a lot that I really didn't understand as I went in there, and I didn't know what I didn't know. When I got to the NFL, I did know that. I said, I'm not going to make that mistake twice. So the first thing I did when I got there was I spoke with the head of the football operations department, two gentlemen, Art Shell, Hall of Fame coach, former coach, and a gentleman named Peter Hadhazy, who were in charge of football operations. And I said, do you have a game operations manual? And they said, yeah, well, of course we do. And I said, well, would you give me the game operations manual? I'd like to read it. And every sport has the analogous document, kind of the rules of the road and what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, and all of that. And I my first day at work was in Jacksonville, just before Super Bowl 39, and I took the book with me and I read it in my hotel room every night till I got to the end of it. And then I arranged a meeting with the football operations team and said, all right, I have a few questions on the book. And they kind of looked at me and said, you actually read that? And I said, yeah, I did. And they were like, nobody reads that. Like, they were really, I guess they were impressed, because I was sort of the hockey guy coming in. And it's like, what does the hockey guy know about football? Well, the hockey guy learned about what he needed to know. There's ways that you take care of the ice. Well, there's ways you take care of the turf. And there are things you can do and there's things you can't do. And here's what you can do pregame, and here's how you do what you can do pregame, and all of those types of things. There were rules of the road. And I think they were really impressed that I took the time, energy, and effort. And parenthetically, when I went to work on the Indy 500, I did the same thing, and said, I need to talk to the race operations director, so I could know what I don't know. And that's really important, when you go from and I imagine many of your listeners aren't in the same kind of situation I was, where you've got basically one client, right? Your client is hockey, your client is football, your client is, whatever sport it is. It's again, understanding the culture of the place you're in. And because they take those things really, really seriously. And that was the first thing. The second, which was really interesting and eye-opening, my predecessor was still on board when the ball was kicked off in Jacksonville for Super Bowl 39. It was the Patriots and the Eagles. And I didn't want to get in the way, but I wanted to be exposed to everything that I thought I could be. So I did take a walkie-talkie and I put it on and I listened to it the entire day. And most of the time I was down on the sidelines, but, wandered around the stadium, but I would listen to everything. And I remember when I was looking out of my hotel room window, I was looking around at what the Super Bowl was. And it was everywhere, and it was big, and there were tons of people. And I'm like, oh my God, this thing is so huge. How am I ever going to manage this? I managed All-Star games and Stanley Cups and things like that, and those were big, but this was on a level all to itself. And Roger Goodell, who was not yet commissioner, he was my boss at the time, said, you're here to take this to a new level. And I said to myself, I don't know what that level is. This is a level unto itself. Like, how do I get it to whatever the next thing is, the next milestone? So I listened to this radio, and every call that went up to the command center, to the control area, I'd heard everything like that before. There was just more of it. I mean, there was more radio traffic than I've ever heard. But all of the questions, all of the issues, I've heard them before. And I said, okay, now I get it. Now I understand. I have to take this in pieces and just apply what I've been doing to something bigger and more exposed. And it made me feel better. It made me feel like I could do it. Um, the other thing I did when I started conducting my first Super Bowl meetings with, I don't know, gosh, there were 150, 200 people in the room. I said, I need to let people know that I don't know everything. It's my first Super Bowl coming up. I'd been exposed to a few of them. I worked on a halftime show. I had been down in Jacksonville kind of observing. And I said, I really need to let people know that I'm a human and that I don't know everything and I don't think I know everything. And my predecessor, who had been there for more than 20 years, had everything up here. So I started off the first meeting with a slide that said, assume nothing, double check everything. And I said that because I didn't want people to think that just because something automatically happened in the past, that they relied on, that they needed something and it was there, that I would know that they needed it and that I would know it would need to be there. So I said, assume nothing, double check everything. And then I said, I'm going to start every meeting with that. So I did. And it became kind of a mantra. And it was successful. People really rose to the occasion and helped me help them do their jobs. And so I said, the next year, let's come up with a new one. And based on the problems that I saw or the challenges I saw. And the next one was communicate or die. And that became the mantra for that year. I started every meeting with that, communicate or die. And ultimately, I ended up having a different one every year. And it focused the team. In the beginning, it covered my butt. As it progressed, it focused the team on how we should do business together and how we're going to execute this together, recognizing that some of the best event people in the world were pulling this thing together every year. And, one of the last ones was fans first. Think about everything you're doing and how does it affect the fan? Even if you're just planning stuff, even if it's behind the scenes stuff, everything we do affects the fan. Everything we do affects the experience of the guest. That we sometimes forgot that. And after a year when it was apparent we did forget it, we changed the mantra for the following year. And I felt that those were really great ways of getting the team focused on the work ahead.
I love that. The fans first thing is quite interesting. Coming from an Olympic environment, it's always, the talk is always athletes first, right? It's athletes are the heart of the games, and it's all about the athlete experience, and everything goes around. It's kind of in the orbit of the athlete. So I think this is very, very interesting. This fans first approach. I like it. You sent me a couple of stories I want to make sure we get to that are part of your NFL experience. And one of those was involving Hurricane Katrina. And so I'm wondering if you can tell the story about the telethon that was staged on Monday Night Football game with respect to Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah, I was relatively new to the league. I started in January 2005, and in September 2005, Katrina hit New Orleans. And as many people may recall, the Superdome was a refuge of last resort. It was horror, what people went through there. And I was in Los Angeles where we were preparing to stage the NFL kickoff, which was a big concert right before the first game of the season on opening day. And we were in rehearsal. I think it was the night before the kickoff. And I got a call from Joe Brown, who was the head of PR at the NFL. And he said, when are you getting back to New York? We need you. And I said, I was going to come back after, kickoff. And he said, well, get on the red eye then and get back here because we need to plan a telethon. and it's happening in 10 days. And I said, okay, where it's the Bush Clinton Katrina Fund, which was, George Bush and Bill Clinton working together on a way of raising funds for the recovery of New Orleans. And I said, he said, the telethon's in 10 days. And I said, okay, well, where are we doing it? And he said, well, that's the first thing you have to figure out. And it's on you. So, get back here as soon as you can. So I did. Next night, took the red eye back, went right to the office, went right into meetings. Where are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? I recognize that there's a function, a fundraising function. So it's not just about what's going to be in front of the camera, but it's also going to be what's behind the scenes in terms of accepting payments and donations and that sort of thing, and how you're going to get that done where no system exists. And we were able to actually work with ABC and borrow, honest to God, the Good Morning America set in Times Square. And, as soon as Good Morning America was done for the day, we moved in and set up the telethon. And by the way, it had to be moved back out overnight so that they could do Good Morning America the next day too. The reason it was being done in 10 days was New Orleans was playing the Giants. They were supposed to play it at the Superdome, and the Superdome had holes in it, and it was a disaster zone. So they moved the game to the Meadowlands and played the game in New York. And then pre-game and during the intermission between, there were 2 games that night. In between the 2 games, we activated this telethon at the Good Morning America set. It took everybody, every department at the NFL to get this thing going. And the partnership of ABC, which was huge, to be able to give us this opportunity to use their facilities. What we did at the time, because we had no payment mechanism, is we worked with Ticketmaster to do that. So Ticketmaster was kind of the back of house very quietly. They didn't really want people to know they were doing it, but now people know if they're listening to this podcast. So, make sure that everybody knows. And they, everybody just pitched in, every vendor, every partner that we had, pitched in to make it happen. And I have to say, there was kind of this story arc from that night until a year later. I went down to New Orleans right after that, with a small team of people who were sent down to take a look at the dome and figure out whether any games could be played there that season. It was right at the beginning of the 2005 season. And there was no possible way. Actually, when we got to New Orleans, you could fire a cannon down the middle of the airport concourse and not hit anybody. I mean, there was nobody moving in, nobody moving out. And we determined that the stadium wasn't usable. And we were told by the commissioner to find ways to make sure that by next season it was going to be usable. And it was. A year later, the NFL staged a big party outside the dome. The Goo Goo Dolls played. Everybody in the city was offered the opportunity to come. I think we have about 25,000 people there. And this is before the doors opened for the first game coming back after Katrina a year later. And when we opened the doors, there was a pregame show on ESPN, which people may remember. It had U2 and Green Day singing "The Saints Are Coming," and Goo Goo Dolls outside did "Better Days," which was, tremendous. I mean, it wasn't a dry eye in the house. It was just an incredible experience. That was the night, I've been told by many people, because I went back and did a Super Bowl some years later there. That was the night that the people of New Orleans or people in New Orleans felt that things were going to be okay again, because the city had been devastated and so many people moved away that never came back. And doing that first game back may have been the most important and meaningful thing that I had ever done or ever been associated with. It wasn't a Super Bowl. It was the place that stadium, that team, that event had in people's psyches down there. It really kind of repaired their hearts and souls. And that was a remarkable thing to be associated with.
It's an absolutely beautiful story, and I really appreciate you sharing it. I'm trying to remember. Uh, yeah, where did the Saints play during that season? Because they couldn't play in the Superdome.
Yeah, first they played in San Antonio, and then they moved to Baton Rouge and played at LSU. And we were helping them every place we could. You know, we sent our ticket director down there to help them because they had all these. We were in the middle of the season, or the season had started, so re-ticketing everybody and who had tickets, who wanted to keep their tickets, and selling additional tickets and making sure that the team was well supported. It was a big thing. I mean, it really took a lot of people at the league to make that happen.
And the layperson or the casual or even the super fan, they don't really understand the level of effort that's required to do something like that. So I appreciate you shedding a little bit of light on it. You did mention that the Super Bowl did return to New Orleans eventually, and which was fantastic. The Super Bowl was also infamous in New Orleans because the power went out. And I remember watching that game thinking, what in the world happened? And as an event person, I was just thinking to myself, what is going through everybody's mind when the power goes out? There is the organizers. I'm curious, what's your as you look back, what's your memory of that experience in New Orleans?
When something goes wrong, you hope you're the only one who notices it. That's not the case when it happens at the Super Bowl. There's 115 million people watching on television. There's 70,000 people outside your window waiting for you to fix things. And interestingly enough, if that's not pressure enough for you, I had a crew from 60 Minutes standing right next to me at the time that the lights went out. Armin Katayan was the correspondent, and suddenly the behind the scenes item that they were doing for a show called 60 Minutes Sports on Showtime became something else. The ball had just been kicked off for the second half, right after the halftime show that Beyonce did, which was tremendous, and a lot of people blamed her show for knocking out the lights. That's not what happened at all. In fact, the halftime show was on its own generators because it took up a whole lot of power. And what happened was when the lights were restored to start the second half, when they were re-illuminated, and a lot of other things came back online, after the halftime show, a relay on one of the feeder cables, so giant circuit breaker, saw power consumption increasing dramatically over a short period of time. And it's designed to shut itself off if that happens because it thinks there's a power surge. And we're talking about a power surge of monumental proportions. And so it had just been replaced. So post-Katrina, the electrical system had not been replaced. So, of course, about 6 weeks before the Super Bowl, the power company replaced all the relays, all the power cables. And it was installed with factory settings, like, just about any piece of equipment. It wasn't built or didn't anticipate what happened. So it shut itself off. And luckily, we had law enforcement there and security professionals who determined it wasn't a fire, it wasn't a cyber attack, it wasn't a terror attack. We had to know that right away because you have 70,000 people there. And if they're looking at Twitter and Facebook and other social media platforms to determine what their next move is going to be, and I'm not talking to them, that's a problem. And so within 90 seconds, we knew that we had a safe environment. We wanted to tell people to stay in place and not leave. The reason we could do that is because stadiums and arenas are equipped with battery backup public address systems that are good for about a half an hour for just this purpose. You don't want the power to go out and you can't talk to people. People will make their own decisions. If they stampede to the doors, you've got a problem. So the first thing we did before we even knew what the problem was we told people to stay in place because, again, we knew it was a safe environment. And then we determined that there was a power feeder that had failed. There were two that come into the Superdome. We had a backup. The backup had been installed during this same process just about 6 weeks before. Never had a backup before. Thank God we did. But what's really remarkable is that the operations team for the stadium has a procedure if something like this were to happen, and that's to shut off all the unnecessary, non-life safety power drains, escalators and lighting in the concourses, and beer taps, although a lot of people would argue that that's pretty important. Refrigeration, HVAC, all that stuff got shut off. And it's a good thing they did, because what was after the investigation some weeks later, it was determined if they hadn't, the other side would have failed too. And then we're in darkness. And there's one feeder cable that can be used as a backup, not two. Game would have been over. They were the ones who kept us from having a complete disaster. Now, after 24 minutes, the operations team restored the power, and after 24 minutes, we're ready to go. And of course, CBS, who has more than 100 million people watching, they want us to get started in a hurry. And we did not do that. We spent another 10 minutes to make sure that all the information systems, all of the electronic systems were back up and running. Score clock, coach to quarterback systems, instant replay, all of that sort of stuff. Because if we didn't do that, and there was another score or a penalty, a controversial play, whatever it was, and the officials go to take a look at the instant replay and there is none, now you've got a different problem, right? You have a potentially inauthentic game. We still have Ray Lewis from the Baltimore Ravens is still convinced that we did this on purpose, right? To change the momentum of the game, because the Ravens were just killing the 49ers. And then the 49ers caught up in the second half. So he's convinced we did it on purpose. Not so. And we spent another 10 minutes going through every system before we kick the ball off again. And it's a good thing we did, because there was one coach to quarterback system didn't work. And we got it up and running. We got it to work, and everything was fine from that point forward. But that was really important. It's that lesson is respond to the problem, don't react to the problem, right? And if we had reacted, and it was like television is saying, get the ball kicked off, get the ball kicked off, get the ball kicked off. And we're like, hold on. It's the Super Bowl. We've been dead in the water for 24 minutes. What's another 10? Let's get this right. And that's what we did.
One of the reasons I love this story as you're retelling it, I come back to the casual fan, the person who's not involved in this business, thinking, why is it taking them so long to get the power back on, right? What's going on? Don't they have any idea what they're doing? And then you look at it from the other perspective, it's like, it's actually pretty miraculous. You got the power back on and you got everything up and running and functioning properly in this amount of time. Because in these events, I come from more of an Olympic space, but you'll do a technical rehearsal, and it's several days, and then you'll do another technical rehearsal and it's several days. And if you find a problem, it takes time to fix those problems. So being able to actually have this happen and then recover, in my perspective, in a short period of time, that, kudos to you and to the
Well,
team for
to
actually
the
being able to
team,
pull that
really.
off.
Yeah, to the team. It really was a team sport without question. And we got lucky. Um, because I mentioned that we had a crew from 60 Minutes right beside us. They documented the whole thing. And we didn't even look at the camera. I forgot the cameras were even there. And I remember when that episode was going to air, I got a call from one of the producers of the show, and he said, "I I want you to know that we documented what you guys did, and I don't know what kind of pressure you're under right now, but I wanted you to know that I think we did a fair job of documenting what happened." And he couldn't have been nicer. Alan Goldberg, he said, I want you to call me when the show is finished and let me know if you're okay. And I said to myself, holy smoke, am I in trouble? My boss is going to see this. My colleagues are going to see it. My neighbors are going to see it. My family's going to see it. Oh my God, what is he warning me about? And so I sat on the edge of my couch watching this with my wife had her arms around me the entire time. And you know what? It was fair. They documented it. It ended up being a good thing that, nobody could say, well, what were they doing up there? To your point, Christian, what were they doing up there for 24 minutes or 34 minutes? And which is what it was, once we got started again. And it ended up being a good day. And part of that is because we did tabletop exercises for emergencies, crisis management type of emergencies, and we did every year. I don't know if they still do it, but I made sure we did it every year. And the whole team went right back into problem solving mode like we did during this tabletop simulation. And although we never rehearsed a power failure, we rehearsed how we respond to problems. And it made all the difference. We just went right back into problem solving mode.
Well, that's again, it's fascinating, and I really appreciate you sharing that experience. You mentioned, well, I don't know what they're doing in the NFL anymore because you eventually left the NFL, and so I'm curious about that. You're again with the NFL for a long period of time, and then you leave. I don't know what the timing is between that and founding this new company, Fast Traffic. But talk to us a little bit about that transition.
I meant to start my own firm before I left the NFL. And I was very fortunate to be entrusted with the management of 9 Super Bowls, as well as NFL drafts and things of that nature, and lots of other stuff. And I am so appreciative of what the NFL did for me, and the trust that they had in me. And but I felt after 23 years of working for sports leagues and 10 plus working for Radio City, I wanted to try new things. I just wanted to try new things. I didn't think I could grow anymore doing the same thing every year. And the difference between running your own firm and working for sports leagues for 23 years is when you're working for the sports league, you're on a treadmill you can't control. When you're working for yourself, you're working on a treadmill you can control. It's still a treadmill, but you can determine what you do and what you take on. And I said, that's really what I want the back half is being generous, back half of my career to be. And so I talked to a number of people that I trusted in the event world and in the venue world and in the sports world, and they were all very encouraging to me and said, "Well, when you're ready, call me." And so I said to myself after the Super Bowl in New York, which was actually in New Jersey, but New York market, um, where it's the first outdoor winter Super Bowl, where the contingency planning was off the chart, right? Because you have to, just like we did for the Winter Classic or the Heritage Classic, except Super Bowl is, like I said, on a level unto itself. If we have to, if I've been able to manage that well, that's the pinnacle for me for Super Bowls. Um, it's time. And everything worked out fine. I mean, obviously there's always stuff that goes wrong. Um, and there were, but I felt like I had done a good job and it's time. So that's what I did. And then I had the opportunity to be on the development team for the rooftop. I had the opportunity to start working on the Indy. Um, I started working with the Pro Football Hall of Fame, all of those really relatively quickly. So, the period of time you asked between my walking out the door on Park Avenue, my walking in the door at Fast Traffic was overnight.
Well, one other story I want to get to that you talked to me about before, or through an email exchange, uh, highlights the global nature, because everything we've talked about up until now has happened in North America. Everything that we've discussed, but you've also had experience globally as well, and you have an interesting story
Mm.
that happened in Innsbruck, and so I want to dive into that one.
Yeah, I was blessed to be able to work at the NFL in the UK and Mexico on games. At the NHL, which just did a game in Melbourne, Australia, which I've done some work on Australia, and it's fascinating. They had games in Japan and Finland, Sweden, um, German, and Austria actually, and I had the opportunity to work on all of those, and every one of those countries has a different culture, and they have different assumptions, and they have different languages. Worked in the UK on some things as well, which was, again, culturally different, but at least you're talking the same language. And so I learned that there are different ways of working in different countries, and you work on the Olympics, so you know that. I was, again, I didn't know what I didn't know. And just, one quick story about how clear communication is really important, right? And culture, you have to understand how they do business, but clear communication is really important. I had asked the promoter for that game in Innsbruck for a bilingual announcer. We had two teams that were from North America. Um, Neither of them were from French Canada, so we had to make sure that the players could hear the penalty announcements and the goals and assists and any other important information. 1 minute to go in the period, that sort of thing. That they would hear it in English, and then the audience would hear it in German. So I, of course, asked the promoter for a bilingual announcer, and I said, "Look, I'd like to see him the day before the game, have him come out to the arena, and just so I could talk him through the rules as they are played in North America. In Europe, they play on a different surface. The rules are a little bit different. The countdown clock, instead of going to zero, goes up to 20 down, per period, that sort of thing. So I just wanted to make sure that he was aware of all of those things. And in walks Carl, really good guy. His English is okay. We understand each other. And I said, okay, so first you make this announcement in English, and then you make it in German. And he says, no, Frank, I do the German. You do the Canadian. And I said, but I thought, you would be comfortable as a bilingual announcer. And he said, yes, in German and Italian, because we were very close to the Italian border. So in Innsbruck, bilingual means German and Italian. It does not mean English. So I ended up being the English speaking announcer for that game. And Carl sat beside me, as the German announcer. I didn't have him announce in Italian. There was no real reason for that. And I remember my boss coming down to the timekeeper's bench where we were after the game, and he said, "Where did you find that English speaking announcer? His accent was impeccable." And I never told him it was me, but it was me.
Well, now all is revealed. Yeah. Oh, what an amazing story! Gosh, yeah. I can't believe the time has gone for me so quickly. I could sit here and listen to these stories for days. Before we wrap up our conversation, any other stories or experiences you feel you want to share with our listeners and viewers?
I think for those of us who have people knocking on our door, students perhaps that are listening, get involved. Get your foot in the door. I got into this as an usher. You're the sum total of all of your experiences. Everything you ever learn, everything you ever do is transferable to the next thing. And I would say, get in there, get your foot in the door and do whatever it is, roll up your sleeve, and nothing is beneath you.
I think that's great advice. I remember I started out in Salt Lake, 2002. I left IBM to go work for an Olympic Games, and one of the mantras there was "No job is too small," right? And so whether it's you announcing, okay, well, somebody's got to do this. I guess I'll step in and I'll be the PA guy, the PA announcer in Innsbruck. Or I remember, the guy that ran the Rice Eccles Stadium venue for the opening ceremony for the Salt Lake 2002 games, and comes in, 5 o'clock in the morning. He's out there shoveling snow because somebody needed to shovel the snow. I think it's fantastic advice, and I really appreciate you sharing that. I know we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but tell us a little bit more about Fast Traffic, the kinds of services that you're providing, and should any of our listeners or viewers be interested in connecting with you and learning more about how you could potentially help them, tell us what's the best way for them to reach out and connect with you.
Sure. Well, we again work on projects. So whether it's an event project or a venue development project or a design project, we put the right teams of people together, the best in the industry. That's at least what I try to do, to meet the needs of whatever that project is. So as I mentioned, we worked for the Howard Hughes Corporation on the South Street Seaport, the rooftop at Pier 17. That was venue development. We consulted to the Milwaukee Bucks when they were building the Deer District outside their new Fiserv Forum, because they wanted a big place that was kind of event ready. It's a big plaza out in front of the building. We had nothing to do with the inside. We were just consulted on what to do with the outside, what kind of infrastructure was required. We do, full-on production, working again with production partners. we did the Major League Baseball draft and the All-Star red carpet show at the All-Star game this past year, actually the last 3 years, for Major League Baseball. Produced the pre-race show for the Indy 500. What's really very interesting about that one is it's two of us. The production company, the production team is Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Frequently, we're brought in to be part of an organization that already exists. Pro Football Hall of Fame is exactly the same thing. We work on the Hall of Fame game. We work on the Merlin Olsen Super Bowl luncheon. We work on the Hall of Fame enshrinement ceremony. The team I work with there, we bring, again, one production coordinator, is them. And that, I think, is what differentiates us. We don't pop everybody that we can think of on top of an event. If you need just one person to help you develop the creative, develop the run of show, call cues or don't call cues, whatever it happens to be, we fit the right team. And if it's not a team, it may just be one person to help you get your job done. If you want to reach me, there's two ways to do that. One is, get on LinkedIn with me. I have a LinkedIn profile. A lot of people DM me from that, or from Twitter or X or whatever they call it this week. My handle on Twitter is Sup Events, SUP events. And you can also reach out through our website, fasttrafficevents.com. And we have a contact page on there.
All right, fantastic. So people, please do reach out to Frank. Frank, it's been an immense pleasure for me to have this conversation, to get to know you. Thank you so much for spending the time to share your story. And listeners and viewers, thank you also for tuning in. Please like and subscribe to our podcast, and we'll catch you again soon. Frank, thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, everyone.